One inmate inside this prison was handed a whole life order and expected to die behind bars, but after more than 3 decades in prison, he was released. Another was beaten, stamped on, and almost beheaded during a brutal attack in the prison exercise yard. And another took part in a 4.5-hour hostage siege, telling a prison officer, "I've killed 2 people. I will kill you." This is HMP Woodhill. Located in Milton Keynes, HMP Woodhill is a Category B prison that has housed some of Britain's most unpredictable offenders. Murderers, violent repeat offenders, and prisoners considered too dangerous for many other establishments have all passed through its gates. After receiving requests to cover this prison, in this video we'll be looking at inmates linked to HMP Woodhill, both past and present, and the crimes that they committed. These are just some of the most dangerous inmates linked to HMP Woodhill. This first inmate was handed a whole life order and was expected to die in prison, but just months ago he was released. This is the case of Reginald Wilson. On the 4th of February 1990, 16-year-old Laura Burkett made a discovery that no child should ever have to make. Inside her home in Middlesbrough, she found the body of her dad, Dr. David Burkett. David was a respected skin specialist, a recently divorced father of 3, and a consultant paleopathologist with a fascination for the study of bones. By all accounts, he was well liked and dedicated to his work. The attack had been brutal. Dr. Burkett had been struck across the head 17 times with a blunt object, believed to have likely been a hammer. The repeated blows fractured his skull and caused fatal brain injuries. Investigators also discovered green rope tied around his wrists. The killer had used it to drag David's body from the entrance of the house into his study, believing it would reduce the forensic evidence linking him to the murder. Several items had been stolen, including David's wallet, his pocket watch, and perhaps the most unusual, a medieval skull. Inside the house, detectives found a letter claiming to be from a delivery company. It stated that an attempted delivery had been made and asked Dr. Burkett to phone a number to rearrange it. This phone number turned out to be that of a nearby telephone booth. But police believed this letter to be a ploy, carefully designed to gain access to the property of a man who lived alone. Then things became even more disturbing. The killer began taunting detectives. A letter was sent to police, of which part had been written using a stencil, before eventually switching to their own handwriting. And within the letter was a chilling admission. "Smashing his head in gave me a buzz better than smack. Could get addicted to it." The investigation continued for months until detectives discovered a crucial piece of evidence that the killer had potentially accidentally left behind. At the scene was a blood-stained carrier bag, and when forensic experts examined it, they recovered a thumbprint, a print that belonged to 25-year-old Reginald Wilson, a man who had previously come to police attention following previous convictions of arson and theft of a motorbike. Detectives would later admit that had Wilson not left the bag behind, there was a very real chance that he may never have been identified. But as detectives examined Wilson's plans, they came to a chilling conclusion. They believed that Dr. Burkett had never been the true target. Wilson only murdered David to attract a major police response. His ultimate goal was allegedly to lure officers into a situation where he could kill them. In his own words, he wanted to kill as many pigs as I can. When officers searched Wilson's home, they found a whole array of weapons. There was a sawn-off shotgun, 73 cartridges, a crossbow, knuckle dusters, survival equipment, and even a rocket launcher. They also discovered a notebook containing the names and addresses of local police officers. At trial, Wilson was described as a psychopath who would kill again and again. When he appeared in court, he showed little remorse, and at one point he shouted, "You may contain me, but you'll never control me." He was convicted of murder and handed a whole life order. For David Burkett's family, it seemed justice had been done. But years later, that certainty began to unravel. In 2008, the family were devastated to learn that Wilson's sentence had been reviewed and that officials had concluded that the murder was not serious enough to justify a whole life order. His tariff was reduced to 18 years. But this decision triggered outrage and an appeal from the family. During further reviews, it emerged that important information had not been properly considered. The judge claimed to take into consideration that Wilson was suffering an untreatable psychotic disorder, and eventually Wilson's minimum term was increased to 30 years, making him eligible for parole in 2021. But even behind bars, he continued to cause concern. In 1996, he made an unsuccessful attempt to escape from Frankland Prison. Then 3 years later, he attempted to stab a prison officer, reportedly for the second time. Following this, he was transferred to Woodhill. Over the years, he became one of Britain's most closely monitored prisoners and spent lengthy periods in highly restrictive conditions. Now known as Reginald Wilson, he continued serving his sentence after becoming eligible for parole. In 2023, the parole board rejected his release, concluding he still posed a risk to the public. But the following years brought significant developments. After being moved to an open prison in November 2023, Wilson was gradually given more freedom. Yet controversy followed him even there. It was revealed that shortly before his release, he had stolen around £30 worth of goods from a shop, despite reportedly having around £6,000 in savings. Despite concerns, the parole board ultimately approved his release. In March 2026, after serving 36 years in prison, Reginald Wilson walked free at the age of 61. But this decision sparked criticism, including from Middlesbrough's MP, who warned that releasing Wilson could prove to be a grave mistake. Justice Secretary David Lammy also asked for the decision to be reconsidered, but the parole board refused. In its ruling, the board stated that Wilson had not demonstrated overt violence towards staff or prisoners since 1999 and had shown significant and sustained improvements in his behaviour during many years in custody. Today, he remains on licence for the rest of his life and is reportedly subject to strict conditions. But after spending decades behind bars for a murder that shocked Middlesbrough, his release remains controversial. Let me know your thoughts. Do you think Reginald Wilson should have been released? This next inmate suffered an attack so brutal that prison officers later compared it to something from a horror film. By the time staff finally entered the exercise yard, it was already too late. This is the case of Taras Nykolyn. Taras Nykolyn was a Ukrainian national who had been living in the United Kingdom under an alias since 2002. His first prison sentence came in June 2014, following an unprovoked attack on a complete stranger. 51-year-old Roger Maxwell had been walking across Wimbledon Common when Nykolyn chased him, forced him to the ground, and repeatedly assaulted him. Roger suffered a broken nose, a fractured wrist, and extensive bruising. For the attack, Nykolyn was sentenced to 16 months in prison. But his violence didn't end there. While serving that sentence at Wandsworth Prison, Nykolyn killed his Egyptian cellmate, 66-year-old Fuad Awale. Nykolyn complained that he prayed too loudly, which led to the brutal attack. On the 4th of May 2015, Nykolyn launched a sustained attack, kicking and stamping on his cellmate, before striking him over the head with a TV. The victim suffered a fractured skull, jaw, and neck, and later died from his injuries. Nykolyn was sentenced to a further 7.5 years in prison. Psychiatrists later concluded that he had likely been suffering from paranoid psychosis during both of the attacks, and he spent a period receiving treatment at Broadmoor Hospital. Then, on the 24th of January 2018, Nykolyn was transferred to HMP Woodhill. More specifically, he was placed in the prison's Challenging Behaviour Strategy Unit, a specialist unit designed to manage some of the prison's system's most dangerous and disruptive inmates. It was there that he came into contact with 3 other prisoners: Stephen Boorman, James Brabbs, and Jibril Rahim. Just after 3 p.m. on the 5th of June 2018, the 4 men were escorted into the exercise yard. This area was enclosed, and the prison officers supervised from the perimeter. What happened next would become one of the most notorious incidents in Woodhill's history. Around 10 minutes after entering the yard, Stephen Boorman suddenly punched Nykolyn in the face. The blow knocked him unconscious, and as Nykolyn laid on the ground, all 3 men joined the attack. They kicked him, stamped on him, and repeatedly assaulted him for around half an hour. During the attack, makeshift weapons were used to slash and cut him, and James Brabbs wrapped a torn bedsheet around Nykolyn's neck in what prosecutors later described as an attempt to behead him. The attackers also threatened prison officers who were watching from outside the exercise yard. Despite witnessing the assault, staff didn't immediately intervene. It would be around 30 minutes before a team of 14 officers finally entered wearing protective equipment. By then, Nykolyn had suffered catastrophic injuries. He sustained 52 separate injuries. The cuts and slash wounds were dramatic, but they were not what killed him. Instead, Nykolyn suffered a severe traumatic brain injury caused by the repeated kicking and stamping. Blood and vomit had also blocked his airway, preventing him from breathing. He died from his injuries. When the attack was eventually over, all 3 men were arrested on suspicion of murder. According to reports, James Brabbs responded, "Well, it's not suspicion, is it?" Investigators later discovered that the attack had not been spontaneous. Evidence suggested the assault had been discussed for around 2 weeks beforehand, and the exact motive was never fully established. Brabbs claimed that Nykolyn was rude and rubbed people up the wrong way. Other reports suggested his nationality or limited English may have played a role, but prosecutors argued the real motive was something else. They believed the 3 men wanted to demonstrate that they were untouchable. All 3 were eventually convicted of murder and received life sentences. Jibril Rahim received a sentence of 20 years and 9 months, added to the sentence he was already serving for attempted murder. There wasn't a whole lot reported about Rahim's history, other than he was serving time for attempted murder. So who exactly were the other 2 men responsible? Stephen Boorman had first been sent to prison in 2012 after a drug-fueled attack on his friend, Darren McMorran. After a day spent drinking and taking cocaine, Boorman suddenly flew into a rage and stabbed Darren 4 times. 3 wounds were to his back and 1 to the chest. Darren survived, but only because he managed to stagger into the street, where passers-by administered life-saving first aid. Boorman was sentenced to 15 years for attempted murder. Psychiatrists later diagnosed him with antisocial personality disorder and noted a particular lack of empathy towards his victims. For his role in Nykolyn's murder, Boorman received a concurrent life sentence with a minimum term of 35 years. James Brabbs had an equally violent past. In 2012, he murdered delivery driver Mohammed Khan in North Yorkshire. Mohammed had been making deliveries in the area when he encountered Brabbs outside a pub. The pair later left together in Mohammed's van. Prosecutors alleged that Brabbs attempted to rob him of money and cannabis before stabbing him in the throat. A witness later heard screams and saw Brabbs disappear down an alleyway. Mohammed had lost consciousness behind the wheel and crashed his van into 2 bollards. It was then that an off-duty police officer discovered him with life-threatening injuries, but despite medical treatment, he later died that day. Brabbs eventually admitted murder and was sentenced to 29.5 years in prison. And yet again, his violence also continued behind bars. In 2015, he assaulted a prison officer Then, in 2017, he attempted to strangle another prisoner at Wakefield, of which both offences resulted in additional prison sentences before he was transferred to Woodhill. For the murder of Nykolyn, Brabbs received a second life sentence, along with a further 10 years to be served consecutively. As a result, he will be in his 70s before becoming eligible for parole. This next inmate was due to be released from prison after murdering his wife. Instead, he was found dead in his cell just 2 days after arriving at Woodhill. This is the case of Bulent Sessacar. Bulent Sessacar was a personal trainer from Croydon, but in December 2012, he would become the centre of a case that shocked the country. On the 20th of December 2012, emergency services received a call after neighbours reported hearing screams coming from a nearby flat. When authorities finally gained entry to the property, they were confronted with a heartbreaking scene. Inside the living room lay 25-year-old Rebecca Sessacar, a nursery nurse and mother. She had been brutally stabbed to death. Nearby, cowering in the same room, was her 6-year-old daughter. The young girl was covered in blood and deeply traumatised after witnessing the attack on her mum. Officers also discovered 2 kitchen knives close to Rebecca's body. The attack had been so violent that the blade of one of the knives had separated from its handle. 29-year-old Sessacar, Rebecca's husband, was arrested immediately at the scene. Rebecca had suffered 58 wounds to her head, face, neck, and upper body. She also had bruising across her body and a bite mark on her cheek, highlighting the sheer ferocity of the attack. As detectives pieced together the events leading up to the murder, they discovered there had been warning signs. Just 2 days before Rebecca was killed, Sessacar had been arrested after attacking her. However, he had been released and allowed to return home. Friends later revealed that Rebecca had been frightened of him. One friend said that Rebecca had told her that Sessacar threatened to hurt her if she didn't allow him back. Over the years, the relationship had become increasingly volatile. During the investigation, it emerged that Sessacar's behaviour had reportedly been heavily influenced by steroid use and cocaine-induced psychosis. When the case reached court, he admitted responsibility for Rebecca's death, but pleaded guilty to manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. Experts diagnosed him with emotionally unstable personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder, and ADHD. The court accepted his plea. Bulent Sessacar was sentenced to just 10 years and 8 months in prison for the murder of his wife, Rebecca. For many, this sentence was controversial, given the brutality of the attack and the fact that Rebecca's young daughter had witnessed her mum's final moments. Yet, years later, it wasn't the murder making headlines. It was what investigators discovered while Sessacar was serving his sentence. While serving his sentence at Gartree Prison, Sessacar became involved in a relationship with a prison officer named Sarah Lowking. Their relationship was revealed in 2022 when prison staff received a tip-off. A search of his cell uncovered cards and letters from an anonymous sender. Investigators soon established that that sender was 36-year-old Sarah Lowking, who was herself in a relationship with another prison officer. The pair were planning a future together after Sessacar's expected release the following year. With this, Sessacar was transferred to HMP Woodhill. Sarah Lowking was prosecuted and received an 18-month prison sentence, suspended for 2 years. Because of concerns about Sessacar's welfare following the move, prison staff increased observations to 3 times per hour. But despite those concerns, just 2 days after arriving at Woodhill, Bulent Sessacar was found dead in his cell. He had taken his own life. It was suggested that he should have been under constant supervision rather than periodic checks. This next inmate murdered his wife. Years later, he too would be found dead in his cell at Woodhill. This is the case of Anil Gill. On the 31st of January 2021, police received a shocking phone call. The caller was 47-year-old Anil Gill. He calmly told the operator that he had killed his wife. He then attempted to justify what had happened, claiming, "She forced me to take cocaine. I didn't want to. She got addicted to drugs and had an affair." Officers were dispatched to the couple's home on Beresford Close in Milton Keynes. When they arrived, they discovered that the truth was far more disturbing than the explanation that Gill had offered. During the early hours of that morning, Gill had launched what the judge would later describe as a ruthless, cold-blooded attack on his 43-year-old wife, Ranjit Gill. Her body was eventually discovered inside the garage, wrapped in a duvet and black bin bags. Investigators found that after carrying out the attack, Gill had dragged Ranjit's body into the garage before attempting to cover up what he had done. He cleaned parts of the house, using bleach on the living room carpet, took a shower, and then went to bed. Hours later, he finally contacted the police. The post-mortem examination revealed the extent of the violence. Ranjit had suffered 18 stab wounds. Some were especially deep, indicating significant force had been used. The final injury was believed to have been a wound to her throat. At around 1 a.m, neighbours had reported hearing a woman screaming, followed by loud thumping sounds coming from their property. As the investigation continued, Gill attempted to shift responsibility away from himself. He admitted killing Ranjit, but denied murder. Instead, he pleaded guilty to manslaughter. He claimed that in the weeks leading up to her death, their relationship had become like a roller coaster. According to Gill, arguments had become frequent because of Ranjit's alleged drug abuse, her lifestyle, and her relationship with another man. He claimed that on the day that she died, he allowed her to purchase cocaine one last time. Gill told the court that on the day of her murder, Ranjit had threatened him with a knife. He claimed that after she put the knife down, he suddenly lost control and went into a frenzy. He insisted that he never intended to cause her serious harm. But the jury did not believe him. Instead, prosecutors painted a very different picture of the marriage. Evidence revealed that Gill had a long history of controlling and abusive behaviour towards his wife. Over the years, he had repeatedly intimidated and assaulted her. On one occasion, he struck her across the back with a wooden plank. On other occasions, he threatened her with both a knife and a sword. He had pushed her down the stairs, he had held a knife to her neck, and would regularly shout at her. Family members described him as dominating and a bully. Ranjit's sister later revealed that she had encouraged her to leave the relationship, but Ranjit was terrified of what might happen if she did. She feared that Gill would hunt her down and kill her. Those fears ultimately proved tragically justified. The jury rejected Gill's claims that he had simply lost self-control and found him guilty of murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 22 years. Loved ones remember Ranjit as a beautiful soul, full of joy, and one of the most caring people that they had ever known. Like the others in this video, Gill's story did not end with his conviction. While serving his sentence, he became involved in the family court proceedings concerning contact with his youngest child. Then in July, a judge ruled that contact should not continue. Just 2 weeks later, prison staff made an unexpected discovery. On the 31st of July, the observation panel of Gill's door was found to have been blocked, preventing staff from seeing inside. Upon entering, Anil Gill was found dead inside his cell. This next inmate became known across the country after trying to attack one of Britain's most notorious prisoners, but by then he had already built a reputation for extreme violence spanning decades. This is the case of Robert Donaldson. Most recently, Robert Donaldson made headlines while serving time at Woodhill after an altercation involving one of Britain's most infamous prisoners, Charles Bronson. Reports stated that Donaldson attempted to attack Bronson, only for the veteran prisoner to fight back. According to Bronson, the confrontation ended with Donaldson receiving 2 hooks and 2 uppercuts before staff intervened. Following the incident, Bronson was later transferred to a different prison. But long before that confrontation, Donaldson had already established himself as a dangerous and unpredictable offender. In March 2004, 29-year-old Donaldson targeted a victim who could hardly have been more vulnerable. 100-year-old Annie Steinberg was asleep in her home when Donaldson broke in. Armed with a mallet, he smashed his way through the back door and entered the property. Annie had been deaf since the age of 12, but she was awoken by the feeling of someone trying to pull rings off her fingers. As she attempted to scream for help, Donaldson stuffed a pair of tights into her mouth. This attack could have ended so much worse if it hadn't been for Annie's son, Wolf, who was also inside the property. Despite being 77 years old himself, Wolf rushed to his mum's aid. During the struggle, Donaldson struck him over the head with a bottle. Both Annie and Wolf survived the attack and eventually recovered from their injuries. He stole Annie's watch and £25 from her purse before fleeing. It was later reported that he had been heavily influenced by drugs at the time, but there was an even darker allegation hanging over him. Just 3 weeks before that robbery, Donaldson had allegedly become involved in an argument with a man named Paul Burke. Donaldson claimed that he had disarmed Paul, who was allegedly armed with a knife, before Donaldson then went on to stab Paul. Paul's body wasn't discovered until around a month later. Investigators believed that after the stabbing, Paul had been left trapped inside an airing cupboard. In a desperate attempt to escape, he reportedly kicked his way through a plasterboard wall before collapsing in an armchair. It was there that he died from his injuries. By the time he had escaped, Donaldson had long disappeared. Authorities later alleged that he had repeatedly returned to the property after the killing to steal items that he could sell, including a TV. Donaldson was eventually convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. For the robbery of Annie, he received a further 12-year sentence. But for Wolf, this outcome brought little comfort. He publicly criticised the sentence, arguing that the additional 12 years meant nothing because it would run alongside the life sentence that Donaldson was already serving. As Wolf put it, the 12 years had been absorbed by the life sentence for murder. Yet, even after being sent to prison, Donaldson's violence didn't stop. In 2014, while being held at Grendon Prison, he carried out another brutal attack. According to reports, Donaldson persuaded a fellow inmate to come to his cell after claiming he wanted a chat. The prisoner had just finished showering and changed his clothes when he made his way to Donaldson's cell. Once inside, Donaldson allegedly attacked him with a homemade blade. The victim later described blood pouring from his throat as Donaldson continued the assault. Desperate to stop the bleeding, he searched for a towel while trying to defend himself. He suffered a severed jugular vein, as well as defense injuries to his forearm, torso, chin and hands. This attack may have been fatal had another prisoner not heard the commotion and raised the alarm. But Donaldson wasn't finished. After leaving his cell, he headed towards the dining area where he rushed towards a prison officer. Witnesses reported hearing him shout, "I'm going to kill him." He grabbed the officer from behind, wrapped an arm around his neck, and held a blade to his throat while making threats. The situation was eventually brought under control, only after other prisoners intervened and restrained him. This attack resulted in Donaldson being transferred to HMP Woodhill, and it was there that he would once again find himself making headlines, this time for the altercation with Charles Bronson. This next inmate was already serving a life sentence for murdering his ex-partner when he killed again behind bars. This is the case of Lee Foye. On the 30th of August 2005, 20-year-old Lee Foye carried out a brutal attack that would leave a young mother dead and a child without his mum. His victim was 19-year-old Lauren Strachan. At the time, Foye was reportedly living with another woman, but despite this, he went to Lauren's home in Corby in Northamptonshire. According to prosecutors, the pair had sex before an argument broke out. It was alleged that Lauren threatened to tell Foye's girlfriend about what had happened. What followed was a sustained and devastating attack. Lauren suffered 47 stab wounds and a further 28 injuries. Evidence showed that he had stamped on her with such force that she suffered a brain hemorrhage. Investigators believed her young son may have also witnessed at least part of what had happened. The following morning, neighbours became concerned after hearing cries of Lauren's 2-year-old son coming from inside the property. When they investigated, they made a heartbreaking discovery. Lauren was dead and her son had been left alone in the house with his mum's body. Foye was later convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 16 years. And just like many of the others in this video, this wasn't the end of his violence. While serving his sentence, he reportedly spoke about fantasies of attacking people he believed had terrorised his family after the crime that he committed. In 2010, he was housed at Grendon Prison in Buckinghamshire. Also housed there was 44-year-old Robert Coelho. Coelho was serving a sentence for serious sexual offences against a child. He had admitted 4 counts of rape, 11 counts of indecent assault, and 1 count of penetrative activity involving a 12-year-old girl. The court later heard that Grendon Prison was so overcrowded that Coelho had been placed on a wing with prisoners who were not sex offenders. Evidence suggested that Coelho had angered other prisoners by discussing the disturbing details of his offences in graphic terms. Foye had made no secret of his views on child sex offenders. During group therapy sessions, he openly stated that he despised their crimes and believed offenders like Coelho should be put down. In August 2010, Foye entered Coelho's cell and locked the door behind him. What happened next was described as a ferocious attack. Coelho was repeatedly beaten and stamped on. The attack was so severe that tread marks from Foye's shoes were left imprinted on his body, and he had suffered catastrophic brain injuries. Later, he was found lying unresponsive in a pool of blood on the floor of his cell. Despite already serving a life sentence, Foye was charged with murder once again. While awaiting trial, he was held at HMP Woodhill. Reports later stated that he had attempted to boycott parts of the proceedings by cutting off both of his ears on separate occasions. His defence team argued that he should be convicted of manslaughter rather than murder, claiming that he was suffering from a personality disorder that substantially impaired his responsibility. But the jury rejected that argument. Instead, Lee Foye was found guilty of murder, and for the second time he received a life sentence. This time, he was ordered to serve a minimum of 35 years, running concurrently with the sentence that he was already serving. This final inmate was involved in the execution-style murders of 2 teenagers, before going on to take part in a prison hostage that left an officer fearing for his life. This is the case of Fuad Awale. Fuad Awale, who was of Somali origin, was just 23 years old when he became involved in one of Milton Keynes' most shocking double murders. On the 26th of May 2011, 18-year-old Armin Ismail and 19-year-old Mohammed Farah were walking together through an alleyway in Milton Keynes. Neither of them knew that they were being targeted. Prosecutors alleged that the murders stemmed from a dispute involving cannabis and a belief that one of the victims had shown Awale disrespect. But Awale did not act alone. He was accompanied by Sharmaik Abdul Qadir, while a third man was also present, but he was later found not guilty. The court heard that the two had travelled to Holland specifically to obtain and smuggle a firearm back into the United Kingdom. Armed with that weapon, they set out to confront their target. Prosecutors alleged that Armin was killed first to prevent him from intervening and to leave Mohammed terrified for what was about to happen. Both were shot through the head. Mohammed died at the scene, while Armin was rushed to hospital but later succumbed to his injuries. Investigators would later conclude that Armin had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Police believe that he was targeted only because he happened to be walking alongside Mohammed. The murders devastated both families. Armin had been living with his sister so he could study business before attending university. His ambition was to help provide for his family and build a better future. Mohammed was remembered as a polite and well-mannered young man who found it easy to make friends wherever he went. Both families strongly denied suggestions that the teenagers had been involved in drugs. When the case eventually came to trial, Awale and Abdul Qadir turned on one another. Each accused the other of pulling the trigger. But the jury rejected their attempts to shift responsibility. Abdul Qadir was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 32 years. Awale received life imprisonment with a minimum term of 38 years. Then, just 2 years later, Awale found himself making headlines once again. On the 26th of May 2013, exactly 2 years after the murders of Armin and Mohammed, Awale participated in a hostage at HMP Full Sutton. Alongside 2 other inmates, he ambushed prison officer Richard Thompson inside a cleaning office. Relations between some Muslim prisoners and prison staff had reportedly become strained in the days following the murder of Lee Rigby. Believing Richard Thompson had a military background, the group targeted him. Armed with makeshift weapons, they launched a violent attack. Thompson suffered a fractured eye socket before being taken hostage. The siege lasted for around 4.5 hours. According to reports, Awale was seen rubbing 2 knives together as if preparing to carve a roast dinner while issuing chilling threats. "Stop struggling. I've killed 2 people. I will kill you." Awale received an additional 6 years on top of his existing sentence and was transferred to a unit designed to hold some of the most dangerous prisoners in the country. Years later, he was moved to HMP Manchester, more commonly known as Strangeways. Initially, prison officials told him that he would be able to associate with just 2 other inmates. However, after arriving, he was informed that those prisoners posed a threat to him. Reports suggested that they were linked to a gang known as Death Before Dishonour, a group allegedly dedicated to targeting Muslim prisoners. As a result, prison officials concluded that there were no suitable inmates with whom Awale could safely associate. Awale also wanted to associate with the killer of Lee Rigby. For long periods, he remained isolated from other prisoners. In 2021, he was involved in another incident after punching a member of staff in the face, in which Awale claimed he acted in self-defense. Following this incident, he was then transferred to HMP Woodhill. Reports later suggested that since 2023, he has not associated with any other prisoners. The prolonged isolation reportedly had a significant impact on his mental health. In 2025, Awale was awarded £241,500 in compensation after developing severe depression while being denied contact with other inmates. £234,000 of this will be paid by taxpayers to cover his legal fees, while £7,500 is granted directly to Awale. Awale is still currently incarcerated and will be eligible for parole in 2057 at the age of 69.